Hey, what's going on, DDO players? Axel here. In this video, I'm going to be going through the races in DDO. This is a guide meant for new players, so I'm going to go through each race, talk a little bit about each of them, give some pros and cons to each of them, and maybe talk about some classes that each race does well in. Now, I've already done a video on classes. I'll link that below in the description if you want to check that out. A couple of things before I get started. First of all, I'm not going to cover iconic races in this video for a couple of reasons. One is just for length, and two is because iconic races start at the middle of the game at level 15, and that's probably not something new players are going to do. Plus, they're all paid anyways, but it just didn't seem relevant in a video for new players. You guys want me to make a video on that? If you do, then comment below and let me know. Maybe I will. Okay, first of all, race in DDO, for the most part, with some exceptions, is not really all that important when it comes to viability. There are exceptions, but a lot of the time in DDO, something like a -2 to a stat that a race might bring isn't all that significant at the end of the day, because in this game you can have, by the time you get to the end game, your main stat can be in the 70s, 80s, 90s, maybe even triple digits. So having just a -2 to a stat isn't the biggest deal in the world, although there are definitely races that are much more optimal than others, but rarely is it a deal breaker. So just want to let you know, if you happen to love, say, halflings or something, just from a lore perspective or something, you can run a halfling in pretty much any race, any class, and do fine. But it's not going to make or break the viability of your character. Rarely does race do that. Okay, and also another thing, race tends to not be a huge deal in DDO for a lot of builds, because a lot of builds don't even dip too much into the racial enhancement tree. So in DDO, you have a pool of points that you can spend on enhancements, and that pool of points is shared between your racial trees and your class trees. So a lot of people will opt to spend all their points, say, or almost all of their points, into their class trees. And since all those points are shared, with the minor exception of racial tomes, all the points are shared. Race tends to be not that big of a deal because you're not investing in the tree anyways for a lot of builds. Certainly not true for other builds. A lot of builds do invest heavily, but that's just another thing that in DDO that generally makes races not as big of a deal. So I'm going to start with the free races. So there are 4 free races in DDO: human, dwarf, elf, and halfling. So we'll start with human. So human is one of the most common, maybe the most common race in the game. It is extremely versatile. It is they do extremely well on a lot of builds. And of the 4 free races, I would say human is definitely the best overall when it comes to its usefulness for the highest variety of builds, highest number of builds. Whereas races like halfling and elf tend to be much more specialized in terms of what classes they do well in. We'll get to those in a little bit. But humans are a very strong race in DDO for a couple reasons. One, they get a free feat at level 1, and feats are basically, if you're a new player, feats are abilities that you can select as you level up. There's basically a big pool of feats, and you can select from that pool as you level up, and humans get one additional selection at level 1, and that's very valuable because there's a lot of classes in DDO that really benefit from an additional feat. Okay, they get a lot of other things in their tree that are very useful, and that also some things that don't involve a lot of points spent in the racial tree. So things like healing amp, humans get healing amp. They get a racial action boost, which is very useful, particularly for melees. So human, great choice. They really are a good choice for any class. They particularly do well with divines, with even with tanks, particularly because of the healing amp. They can do well with any class. There's no class I would say does bad as human, because again, that free feat is always going to be useful no matter what class you pick. Okay, let's move to elf next. So elf. All right, elf has on start, they have +2 dexterity. They have a -2 constitution. They get some useful things in their trees. They get a displacement dragon mark, which is pretty cool. Although dragon marks, I'm not too big on dragon marks in this game because they require you to take a feat, and as I already mentioned, feats tend to be really valuable for a lot of classes. They get spell penetration, spell point enhancements, and other dex. They also get dex bonuses in their tree. There's also an enhancement in their tree they can take to access the arcane archer tree. So elf, I would say, is one of the weaker races in the game. just because they tend to not, the -2 to Constitution tends to really hurt them. Hit points are really important in DDO, but they are a good choice, I think, for some classes. So Ranger in particularly, they're a good choice. They get, with the dexterity bonuses, they get some ranged type enhancements in their tree. I think they can also be an okay choice for wizards, even though they get a -2 Constitution. They get some spell pen and spell point enhancements in their tree. So if you're a new player, I don't think they're, I think human's probably better, but they're probably not a bad choice for a wizard. Okay, next is Halfling. So Halfling gets a +2 bonus to dexterity. They also get a couple of penalties that are unique to them. They have, well, actually to gnomes as well. They get 3/4 carrying capacity, so they can only carry 3/4 the amount of stuff as other races. They get a penalty to intimidate. So the intimidate skill, intimidate in DDO, the intimidate skill is the ability that tanks use to draw the aggro of monsters to them, so to get stuff to attack you, and because of their size, halflings get a penalty to that. They also get a, let's see, a -2 to strength on startup. Their enhancement tree has bonuses to dexterity and to various rogue skills and to sneak attacks. So as you can tell, what they're really good at is being rogues. So rogue is, I would say, probably the best class for halfling. It fits them really well. As a race, they seem to be specifically geared towards being rogues, and they tend to not really be, not a bad choice, but not the best choice really for other classes. Particularly, they're not a good choice for tanks or any kind of strength-based melee, just because they do get that penalty to strength, and they are not great tanks because they get the penalty to intimidate. Okay, let's move on now to Dwarf. Okay, Dwarf is a very hit point focused race, I'd say. Very tanky race. So they get a +2 to Constitution and -2 to Charisma on startup. They get a lot of, say, hit point bonuses in their enhancement tree. They get some bonuses to shields. And they, at the very top of their tree, get an enhancement called Throw Your Weight Around, which lets them use their Constitution score for damage on their melee weapons. Normally that's strength, but they can use con with that enhancement. So as you can tell, dwarves are geared towards being melees. So dwarves are a very good choice for, I would say, for fighters and for barbarians. And really any kind of melee class, really, they can be a good choice. They're a bad choice for sorcerer or warlock, just because they get a -2 to charisma, and those are the main stats of those, the main stat for those classes. But even for those classes, they still do get something. They get hit points, but you don't really want to be taking a -2 to your main stat. That is going to be it for the free races. So I would say most classes that you start out as, human's probably going to be your best choice, I would say, unless you're running, say, a melee, then dwarf can be a good choice. Or if you're running a rogue, halfling can be a good choice. Or if you're running a ranger, elf can be a good choice. But probably for the most classes, human is a good choice. You can't really go wrong with that starting out. So if you're not sure which race to go, probably go human. It really is not going to be a bad choice for any class. Okay, let's move on now to, let's move to the free, or the paid class, paid races, I should say. Okay, let's start with Azemar. Azemar is one of the newer classes. They're like kind of like angelic, celestial type race. They get a +2 on start to wisdom, and they get, one of the most notable traits is they get an ability called Healing Hands, which is a self-healing ability, a really good self-healing ability they get in their tree. And really the only downside to it is it is based on your wisdom score. So you, if you go Azemar with the intent to use their Healing Hands, you have to put an investment into wisdom as well. Just keep that in mind. So it does have a downside. Azemars are a really strong race in DDO. Azemar is great choice, particularly for cleric, favored soul, caster druid, because of the +2 to wisdom and other wisdom enhancements they get in their tree. But they're not really, I would say, not really a bad choice for any class. There's just a very strong race in DDO. Okay, next let's move on to Dragonborn. So Dragonborn is really cool. They're like, part dragon, these part dragon type warriors. Dragonborns get a +2 to strength, +2 to charisma, and -2 to dexterity on character creation. Their unique feature is this cool dragon breath attack that they get, and they can upgrade in their racial tree. They get also both spellcasting and melee enhancements in their tree, so they're good really for a wide variety of classes. They're particularly really good sorcerers, warlocks because of the charisma bonus. They're also can also be really good melees. So really, they're really another race I would say that's not a bad choice for most any class. Okay, Drow Elf. So Drow is a class that actually gets a lot of different bonuses on character creation. So they get a +2 to dexterity, +2 to intelligence, +2 to charisma, and -2 to constitution. One other thing to note about Drow is they're unlocked in DDO really quickly for only 400 favor, which you can earn extremely quickly in game. So if you're a free player, I wouldn't recommend buying Drow Elf just because you can't unlock them so quickly in game. So just another thing to note, they're the first race you unlock very, very quickly. So, but back to what they're good at. They are pretty decent wizard or rogue choice, I would say. They do get the -2 to constitution, which of course hurts them for any class. Constitution, again, is a really important score in DDO that affects your hit points. But their enhancements really, again, they're geared towards, I would say, being casters. So wizards, sorcerers, and then they also do really well as rogue. Rogues really like intelligence as well as dexterity. So getting +2 to both intelligence and dexterity, plus some of the enhancements they have in the tree go well with rogues. Okay, next is Gnome. So Gnome is another small race like Halflings, and they share some of the same penalties. They have a 3/4 carrying capacity, just like Halfling. They also get a penalty to intimidate skill, just like Halflings. They start with +2 to intelligence and -2 to strength. So what they're really geared for is wizards, because they get that +2 to intelligence in addition to intelligence bonuses in their tree. They also get bonuses to the DCs of illusion spells, which not really the most useful spell school in DDO. I think necromancy and enchantment tend to be a lot more useful, but it's something nice to have. They also get permanent blur enhancement, which is pretty nice in their tree. In addition to being great wizards, they can also be pretty good rogues. They get some really helpful enhancements that are more geared towards rogues. What they're not good at is being, of course, tanks because of the intimidate penalty, and really any strength-based melee or strength-based character because of that -2 to strength. Okay, next let's go to Half Elf. Okay, Half Elf is a very unique race in DDO because they get this thing called a dilettante feat, and a dilettante feat gives you some ability or aspects of another class, so they're very flexible in that way. So for example, if you take the cleric dilettante, and you can pick, there's one for each class. That means you can use certain cleric wands and healing with your character, certain wands and scrolls with your character. So you have even if you're running, say, like a fighter, and you take a half elf fighter with a cleric dilettante, you can heal yourself a little bit with these low level cleric spells, or scrolls and wands. I'm sorry. So Half Elf, I would say, in DDO, they're one of the rarer races in the game. I think as a race, they can be very flexible, but generally they tend to just be an okay choice for most classes. I can't really think of a class that Half Elf is definitely the best choice. They tend to be better choices, but they're not particularly a bad choice, I would say, for any class, because they do get the dilettante feat. So that's probably why they're one of the rare classes and rare races in games, because they tend to not be really stand out in any one class. Okay, next let's go to Half Orc. So Half Orc, as you can probably figure, are really good. It's a really good race for melee. So they get a +2 to strength on character creation, but they get a -2 to intelligence and a -2 to charisma. They get a lot of enhancements for melee damage. They get something called Orcish Rage, which gives you a big melee power boost. And it kind of works a little bit like Barbarian Rage. So they're really excellent, particularly for Barbarians and for fighters, and really any strength-based melee DPS build. Half Orc is really good. They're not a very good choice, as you can expect, for caster races. So any caster that has the main status charisma or intelligence. Probably not going to use them for. So they're not very good sorcerers or warlocks or wizards just because of that. There's not really any synergy there. Again, like I said at the beginning of the video, you can totally run a half-orc wizard if you wanted to, and it won't hurt your viability all that much, but it's just not going to be, it's going to be a suboptimal choice. Okay, let's move on to Tiefling. So Tiefling is one of the newest races in DDO, and they tend to be, from what I can tell in game, they're one of the more popular races. They're quite strong. They start with a +2 to charisma, and they also get some really cool abilities in their tree that are geared towards fire and fire damage. So they get a fire SLA, they get a scorch SLA in their tree, and a lot of other enhancements just for fire stuff. They're amazing sorcerers, particularly Fire Savant. Fire Savant Tiefling Sorcerer it tends to be a really popular build that I'm seeing a lot right now, and they're really strong. Really good class race combination. A lot of synergy there. They're also really good warlocks as well. So they're a really good caster race. Okay, let's move on to Warforged. So Warforged is a very unique race in DDO because they have a lot of special qualities that tend to be very useful. They're a strong race in DDO as well. So Warforged is one of only 2 races, the other being Blade Forged, which is an iconic that can be healed with repair spells. So that means, the downside of that is they get a -50% penalty to positive healing. So they can heal with repair spells, but they only heal for half with regular positive energy spells. So if the cleric tries to heal you, and the cleric would normally heal you for 50 hit points, it's only going to hit a Warforged for 25. So that can mean it can be tougher for them to stay alive if they're relying on positive healing. But if they're not relying on positive healing, if say they have a sorcerer or a wizard in their party that can cast repair spells on them, it can make for a really cool party dynamic. They also get a lot of immunities to certain disease states, since they're partially constructs, so they're basically part robot. They're really living constructs in DDO, but they're partial robot. You can think of it as they get immunity to sleep, hold person, energy drain, nausea, exhaustion, and paralyze. So a lot of these nasty effects caster enemies throw at you, Warforged are just immune to. So that's amazing. That's an excellent trait that they have, an advantage that they have. On character creation, they get +2 to Constitution, so they also get extra hit points, but they get a -2 to Wisdom and a -2 to Charisma. And despite them getting a -2 Charisma, they actually make a really good choice for Sorcerer, because Sorcerers can heal themselves with repair spells. So if you run a Warforged Sorcerer, you can heal yourself with repair spells, and that's a great advantage that other, say, if you want to say fleshy or non-construct races can't benefit from. So if you run a human sorcerer, you're going to be stuck with healing yourself with potions or wands or scrolls that you get through UMD until you get to Epic Destinies, but we're not going to talk about that in this video. That's post level 20. But you're going to be stuck with less, with worse healing options than, say, a Warforged Sorcerer would have. But Warforged Sorcerer does have the penalty in that the race starts with a -2 Charisma, which is the main stat of its Sorcerer. So there's a give and a take there with a Sorcerer, but they tend to be a really popular pick for Sorcerer. It also can be good because for Wizards, if you don't want to invest in a Pale Master on a Wizard and you want to go mainly Archmage, you can go Warforged and heal yourself with repair spells. So they can also be good melees in the right party, but again, like I said before, if you're relying on positive healing, it can be an issue. So if you're if you're in a party with wizards or sorcerers that can repair you, it can be good. So Barbarians particularly, they can do well because Barbarians, after Barbarians use their rage ability, there is an exhaustion, a fatigue penalty that they have to deal with, but Warforged are immune to that. So Warforged Barbarians are immune. They don't suffer that penalty after they rage. So that can be a really nice bonus for them. Okay, let's move on to the last race I have to talk about, which is Wood Elf. So not a lot to say about Wood Elves. They're what's called a racial variant. So they are very similar to regular elves. There's some minor differences in their racial trees. I would say the biggest difference is that instead of a -2 to Constitution on startup, they get a -2 to Intelligence. So Wood Elves are also a good choice for Rangers, but they're not a good choice for, unlike regular Elves, I would say they're a worse choice for Wizards just because they get that -2 to Intelligence. So yeah, guys, that's going to be it for this video for all the races. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Again, if you want me to do an Iconics video, let me know. I'd consider doing that if enough people want me to. But guys, yeah, I hope this video helped if you're a new player. And again, check out my other video on classes that I'll link below if you have questions on that. So guys, that's going to be it for this video. Hope you enjoyed. I'll see you next time. Have a good one and take care.